She whispered something I'll never forget. "This is between us, and no one else will ever know." And in that moment, everything changed. The first time I saw her, I didn't know she would change the rhythm of my days so quietly, so completely. It was a casual encounter, an ordinary Monday that somehow felt slightly off-center, like the air itself had shifted just enough for me to notice. She was there, standing by the reception desk, her posture relaxed yet undeniably poised, a presence that seemed to make the space around her breathe differently. She didn't need to speak to command attention. There was a calm confidence in the way she held herself, in the small, deliberate gestures of her hands as she adjusted the strap of her bag, the soft tilt of her head as she listened to someone off to the side. I remember noticing her eyes first, thoughtful, observant, carrying a quiet understanding that made the ordinary seem significant. And then, a faint trace of a smile brushed her lips as she turned, catching my gaze, not with surprise, but with acknowledgement, as if she had already known I'd be looking. My chest tightened for a moment, an unfamiliar flutter that left me suddenly aware of my own heartbeat. She moved with an effortless grace that made the world feel slower. The gentle swish of her hair as she leaned to pick up a folder, the faint warmth of her perfume as she passed me in the hallway. It lingered long enough for me to wonder if she even noticed the effect she had on those around her. There was an understated elegance in everything she did, a contrast between strength and softness that drew me in before I even realized I was leaning closer, straining to catch even the smallest detail of her presence. I caught her glance again, fleeting but deliberate, when our eyes met near the coffee machine later that afternoon. She didn't smile openly this time. Not yet, but there was a quiet acknowledgement there, a subtle recognition that made me feel like we were both playing a delicate game of attention and restraint. And I, for my part, felt that strange, magnetic curiosity, the kind that makes you watch someone's hands when they think you're not, that makes ordinary moments feel charged with significance. It was more than just attraction. It was a sense of knowing, an intuitive awareness that beneath the calm surface there was depth, a story waiting to unfold. Her voice, when she finally spoke to me to ask a simple question about the project, carried warmth and confidence, gentle yet deliberate. I noticed how she paused thoughtfully, how her tone shifted subtly depending on the word she chose, and I found myself listening more carefully than I had in a long time, drawn to the cadence, the nuance, the quiet intelligence that threaded through her every sentence. By the end of that first day, I realized that something imperceptible had shifted in me. Ordinary moments, passing someone in a hallway, handing over a folder, sharing a brief glance, were suddenly weighted with meaning. She had entered my awareness like a gentle, persistent tide, and I could feel the pull, even if I didn't yet understand its direction. And in that quiet, unassuming way, she had begun to occupy space in my thoughts that I hadn't reserved for anyone. That was the beginning, not a thunderclap of passion, but a subtle, magnetic curiosity, a sense that this ordinary day had become the first page of something neither of us could yet name, something delicate and quietly powerful, waiting to grow. A few days after that first fleeting encounter, our paths crossed again in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like quiet inevitability. I found myself in the same small meeting room where a project discussion had gathered a few colleagues. She was already there, seated at the far end of the table, papers neatly arranged, her posture relaxed yet composed. When our eyes met across the room, there was a faint, knowing smile, subtle but charged, that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. The conversation began formally, a discussion about timelines and deliverables, yet it quickly shifted. She asked a question that made me pause, not because it was difficult, but because it was thoughtful in a way I hadn't expected. She listened, not just hearing, but truly listening, leaning slightly forward, her hands resting lightly on the table, fingers gently brushing the edge of a notebook. That small, almost unconscious motion caught me off guard, sending a quiet jolt through me. As we spoke, I noticed the little things, the soft cadence of her voice, the way it rose and fell naturally, carrying warmth without effort. Her laughter was low and unobtrusive, but it had a texture that made the air between us feel suddenly lighter, intimate in a way that didn't require words. At one point, she shared a personal story, an anecdote about a small failure she had faced years ago. The way she recounted it, with calm honesty and a flicker of vulnerability, made me realize she wasn't just confident and graceful. She was human, approachable, someone who had lived and felt deeply. During that conversation, our hands brushed lightly as we exchanged papers. The touch was fleeting, but enough to send a pulse through me. I caught myself holding her gaze a moment too long, memorizing the way her eyes reflected curiosity and warmth. She didn't look away, and I sensed a quiet understanding passing between us, a recognition that this wasn't just a normal professional interaction. There was something comforting in the way she carried herself, an ease that made even mundane conversation feel significant. When she leaned back slightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, it wasn't a gesture meant to attract attention, yet it captivated me. I realized I was listening not just to her words, but to the rhythm of her expressions, the subtle shifts in her posture, the warmth in her presence that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. By the time the meeting ended, I felt an unfamiliar mix of exhilaration and calm, a quiet excitement paired with the deep comfort of having someone unexpectedly open a small window into their world. I walked away thinking about the way her laughter lingered in my mind, the warmth of her hand, the sincerity in her gaze. There was a magnetic pull, subtle and compelling, that drew me toward her in ways I didn't yet fully understand. That afternoon marked a turning point. The intrigue from our first glance had deepened into a connection that felt tangible, quiet but insistent. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't just curiosity, it was the beginning of something layered, nuanced, and profoundly private. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I sensed that she knew it too, though neither of us would speak it aloud just yet. After a few weeks, our encounters became less coincidental and more natural, though still carefully measured. There was an unspoken rhythm to the way we navigated the same spaces, hallways, meeting rooms, coffee breaks, that made each moment feel heavier than it should have been, as if the air itself was charged with quiet tension. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way her hands rested lightly on a railing, the tilt of her head as she listened, the subtle sway of her hair as she moved. Each gesture was small, almost ordinary, but in her presence, ordinary became charged with meaning. The first time I realized the tension between us was mutual, it was during a late afternoon at the office. The room was mostly empty, sunlight spilling across the floor, and she was arranging some papers on the desk. I stepped in to ask a question about the project, but our conversation paused mid-sentence. Her gaze met mine, steady and unflinching, and for a moment it felt as though time had slowed. I could see the faintest catch of curiosity in her eyes, the subtle lift at the corners of her mouth, and a shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the room's air conditioning. We started noticing these little moments more often. A brush of her hand when passing a folder. The warmth of her arm close to mine when she guided me through a workspace. Lingering eye contact to the coffee machine, where we both pretended to check our cups while stealing a glance. There was an unspoken game being played, a delicate push and pull of attention that made ordinary actions feel charged. I felt my awareness sharpen, every shift in her posture or tone suddenly significant. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone in the quiet corridor. The conversation had paused naturally, both of us listening to the soft hum of the building around us. She adjusted her scarf, and her hand lightly brushed mine as it fell back to her side. That fleeting touch sent a spark through me, small but undeniable, and I caught myself holding her gaze longer than necessary, memorizing the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. She didn't look away. Instead, there was a flicker of understanding, subtle and unspoken, that left me suddenly conscious of every inch of space between us. It wasn't just attraction, it was awareness, intimacy born from shared silence, and curiosity mingled with restraint. I began to anticipate these encounters, to linger a little longer in her presence, to notice how she carried herself and how her mood could subtly shift the atmosphere around her. I realized that I was drawn not only to her confidence and grace, but to the quiet depth beneath it, the unspoken vulnerability that peeked through only in these brief, carefully orchestrated moments. By the end of the week, I understood that we were dancing around something more profound, something neither of us could name aloud yet. The glances, the accidental touches, the silent conversations, they were all building a bridge between us, a tension so delicate and deliberate that I could feel it humming in my chest. And as I left the office that evening, I caught myself replaying every small gesture, every fleeting look, wondering how much of this she felt too, and how long it would be before either of us finally crossed the invisible line. It happened one rainy evening, the kind where the city seems hushed under a soft veil of gray, and even the usual hum of traffic feels distant. We had stayed behind after work, ostensibly to finalize a project that had grown unexpectedly complex. The office was quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a gentle glow over scattered papers and empty chairs. Somehow, the ordinary task of sorting through documents became charged with a weight I couldn't quite name. She was seated across from me, her fingers tracing the edge of a notebook absent-mindedly. I noticed the slight furrow in her brow, the way her jaw tightened as she considered her next words. There was a vulnerability in her expression that made me pause, a quiet honesty that I had only glimpsed in fragments before. I cleared my throat, unsure how to bridge the silence, but she spoke first, her voice low and deliberate, almost hesitant. "I'm not usually like this," she said, her eyes meeting mine in a way that held both steadiness and fragility. "I tend to keep things contained, professional, but with you, I feel different." She paused, as if testing the weight of her own admission. The sound of rain tapping gently against the window filled the space between us, a subtle underscore to the tension that had been quietly building over weeks. Her words hung in the air, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief, because the intensity one had sensed between us wasn't entirely one-sided. Anticipation, because I suddenly realized the boundaries of our connection were shifting. I wanted to respond, to assure her that I felt it too, but words felt inadequate, almost too crude for the depth of what we were experiencing. Then she leaned forward slightly, the motion deliberate but unassuming, and placed her hand lightly on the table, just inches from mine. The warmth radiating from her touch was enough to make my chest tighten. She looked at me, and in her gaze, there was both an invitation and a caution, a challenge wrapped in care. "This," she said softly, her voice nearly a whisper, "this is between us, and no one else will ever know." Her words were firm yet gentle, carrying the weight of trust and secrecy, a promise that this bond, fragile and delicate, would remain theirs alone. I felt the gravity of it, the sacredness of being entrusted with someone's heart, even in this quiet, private way. I nodded, words unnecessary, my hand inching closer until it nearly touched hers. There was an electric awareness in the small space between us, a delicate tension that hummed beneath the surface. Her eyes softened, a fleeting smile brushing her lips, and in that moment, the ordinary room transformed. It was no longer just an office. It was a private sanctuary, a space suspended in time where only we existed. That night, the pact was made, not with grand declarations, but with subtle, quiet acknowledgement. We had stepped beyond casual curiosity into something far deeper, an unspoken agreement to protect the intimacy, to honor the trust and vulnerability that had been laid bare. And as the rain continued to fall outside, I realized that this was the moment everything had been leading to, the moment that would define the slow, deliberate path our hearts were beginning to walk together. After the night she spoke those words, a subtle shift settled between us, quiet but unmistakable. Our encounters began to feel less accidental and more intentional, though still carefully veiled in normalcy. There was a delicate rhythm to our interactions, an unspoken understanding that the world outside our private moments didn't need to know what had begun to bloom between us. Each shared glance or small touch carried the weight of that secret, making ordinary experiences feel extraordinary. We found excuses to linger together, small things, inconspicuous and natural. A walk to the nearby coffee shop after work, a shared umbrella in a sudden drizzle, the occasional exchange of notes or articles that reminded us of each other's tastes and thoughts. I began to notice details I hadn't before. The warmth in her hands when she gestured, the soft cadence of her voice when she spoke about something that truly mattered to her, the way her eyes lit up briefly when she laughed at something I said. Each moment felt carefully calibrated, yet entirely sincere, as though the universe had conspired to carve out a private space just for us. One afternoon, we walked through a quiet park, the soft rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant hum of city life forming a gentle backdrop. She reached for my hand instinctively to steady herself over a small step, and I felt a jolt of warmth that wasn't entirely about the touch itself, but about the trust implicit in it. My thumb brushed hers unconsciously, lingering just long enough for us both to notice. Neither of us spoke. Words were unnecessary. In that silence, the intimacy deepened, subtle, unspoken, and utterly compelling. Other moments were quieter, almost mundane to an outsider, yet electric to us. Sitting together in a corner of a cafe, our shoulders brushing as we leaned over a shared notebook, or standing side by side to watch the sunset from a balcony, the warmth of her presence pressed gently against my side. I found myself attuned to her smallest movements, the tilt of her head as she read, the faint shift of her weight when she listened, the soft exhale that escaped when she relaxed. Every detail, however slight, was a thread weaving our private world together. The more time we spent, the more I realized how deeply her presence had begun to settle into my daily life. I looked forward to the moments we could quietly share, the brief interludes that punctuated an otherwise ordinary routine. And I noticed, with equal intensity, how she seemed to feel the same. Her smile lingered longer when she saw me. Her gestures carried subtle warmth, and her glances often held a softness that hinted at the unspoken bond between us. By the end of these weeks, it was clear that our connection had grown beyond fleeting attraction. We had created a sanctuary in the midst of ordinary life, a private world stitched together by small, meaningful moments and shared trust. In that quiet intimacy, I understood the depth of what we were cultivating. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was profound, a slow, deliberate intertwining of hearts and minds, bound by a secret promise and nurtured by the delicate rhythm of everyday life. As our private world continued to deepen, a subtle tension began to thread through it, almost imperceptible at first. The more time I spent with her, the more aware I became of the fragile boundary we had established, the delicate promise that what existed between us remained ours alone. It was intoxicating, but with that exhilaration came hesitation, a quiet, gnawing awareness of the world outside our moments. What if someone noticed? What if our bond, carefully cultivated in whispers and glances, was misunderstood? These thoughts circled in my mind, each one heavy with the weight of responsibility and desire. One evening, after another long day at work, we found ourselves alone in the office once more. Papers scattered across the table, the room dimly lit by the fading sun outside. It felt like time had slowed around us. She was focused on a document, her hand brushing lightly against mine as she passed it over. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but enough to make my pulse spike. I caught her eyes across the table, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the same tension mirrored there. The pull of longing tempered by caution, the tug between what we felt and what we feared. We tried to talk casually, but our conversation stumbled over silences thick with unspoken thoughts. I found myself hesitating before speaking, weighing every word, every gesture. She did the same. There were fleeting moments when I wanted to reach out, to bridge the space between us with something more than a glance or a touch, but hesitation anchored my hand. I could see it in her eyes, too. An internal battle, a quiet conflict between desire and restraint. At one point, our hands brushed again as we reached for the same folder. The contact was electric, sending a shiver up my arm. Yet we both pulled back slightly, a silent acknowledgement that the intensity between us had reached a threshold. My chest tightened as I realized how much I craved her nearness, yet how acutely aware I was of the risks, the fragility of the secret we guarded. There were moments that felt almost unbearable. The way she laughed softly at something I said, and the warmth in her eyes made me ache to close the distance between us. The way she leaned slightly toward me while explaining a detail, a subtle gravity pulling us closer. The brush of her hair as she tucked it behind her ear, sending sparks through me that I could neither name nor suppress. Every small gesture became magnified. Each interaction weighted with the tension of unspoken longing. By the end of that evening, the emotional current between us had reached its peak. The hesitation, the fear of exposure, and the undeniable pull of desire collided into a single, charged awareness. We wanted each other, yes, but we also respected the fragile intimacy we had created. Neither of us crossed the line, yet both of us felt it vibrating in the air, an invisible thread binding us, taut with emotion and promise. It was a moment of quiet revelation. The bond we had forged was no longer just secret or delicate. It was alive, intense, and impossible to ignore. And though the conflict and hesitation lingered, they only made the connection between us feel more profound, more real, more worth holding on to. In that tension, I realized sometimes love is not just the closeness we share, but the patience and restraint that prove its depth. After weeks of quiet tension, hesitant touches, and shared glances, there came a day when the invisible walls between us seemed to soften, just enough for the bond we had nurtured to breathe freely. It was a late afternoon, the office nearly empty, the golden light of the setting sun spilling through the windows and casting long, soft shadows across the floor. Somehow, in that serene quiet, the world outside faded, leaving only the two of us in a space that felt suspended in time. We were seated side by side at a small table, reviewing the final details of a project that had brought us together so often. But for once, our conversation wasn't strictly about work. She leaned slightly toward me, her shoulder brushing mine gently, and I felt the familiar warmth radiating from her. Her presence was steady, calming, yet filled with a subtle electricity that made my chest tighten in the best possible way. I noticed the way her fingers rested lightly near mine on the table, not touching, but close enough that the air between us seemed to hum with anticipation. In that moment, words became unnecessary. There was an understanding in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that what we shared was rare, precious, and real. The pact we had made, the secret that bound us together, no longer felt like a barrier but a testament to our trust. I reached out instinctively, my hand hovering near hers, and she responded with the faintest shift of her fingers, a delicate acceptance that spoke volumes. It was as if we were both saying, "We are here, together, completely present." We spent the next hour simply existing in each other's presence. She brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and I felt the intimacy of that simple gesture as though it were a gentle caress. She laughed softly at something I murmured under my breath, and the sound resonated in me, warm and familiar. Our shoulders touched, our hands occasionally meeting in fleeting, meaningful contact, and every movement, every glance, reinforced the quiet intensity of our connection. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden declaration, just the natural unfolding of a bond built on trust, subtle desire, and emotional honesty. I realized that this was love in its purest, most enduring form, patient, respectful, and deeply attuned to one another. We had both navigated hesitation, conflict, and vulnerability, and now the emotional tension had transformed into a serene, steady intimacy that felt unshakable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the room in soft amber light. I found myself marveling at how completely she had become a part of my world. The quiet moments, the shared smiles, the brushes of warmth, they weren't fleeting. They were the foundation of something lasting. And in her presence, I felt seen, understood, and cherished in a way that went far beyond words. Finally, as we packed up to leave, our hands brushed one last time, lingering just long enough for both of us to savor the connection. She gave me a look that was equal parts mischief, tenderness, and certainty, and I knew we had arrived at a place neither of us had expected, yet both had longed for. In that private, unspoken understanding, our story reached its full, quiet resolution. A slow, deliberate love that was ours alone, profound in its simplicity and enduring in its warmth.